Could you describe the two hormonal phases which led to the two distinct versions of the female body that you talk about?
Yeah, so, women have cycles, and even though we aren't really taught about what they mean for what it means to be female beyond just having a period every month or trying to get pregnant, it as our hormones shift across the cycle, it creates two distinct versions of what it means to be yourself and if you're a woman. And the first, if we think about the menstrual cycle, and on average it's about 28 days. During that 28-day period, a woman shifts from a period of rising and falling levels of estrogen, and this happens during the first 2 weeks of the cycle. And we call this the follicular phase of the cycle. And this is during a time when sex can lead to conception, and the body and the brain are orienting themselves to a version that is optimized for attraction and for sex. And so we see all kinds of interesting psychological and behavioral changes that happen in the first half of the cycle that are consistent with the idea of being optimized for these goals. And then after ovulation occurs, which generally happens on average around day 14, the last 2 weeks of the cycle, the women's bodies shift gears, and this is characterized by the rise and fall of women's second primary sex hormone, progesterone. And this is optimizing the brain and the body and behavior for implantation and pregnancy. And so each cycle, women's bodies are shifting between these two different states, right, that are optimized for these two different goals, both of which are necessary for the female body to reproduce. And what it means is it creates a distinct version of being, right? And so you're either a version of yourself that's kind of, made for sex and attraction, or a version of yourself that's made for implantation and pregnancy. And it has interesting implications for the way that women experience themselves and the world around them.
Mm. And in your book, you write that PMS isn't a flaw in female biology; it's a sign of a body that's out of sync with the world it lives in. So, how do you see that mismatch then playing out in women's daily lives, in how we work, in how we train, or even in how we socialize?
Yeah, so for medicine, I mean, just as a practice, and as a study of research, is something that originally was conducted almost exclusively on men and people with male bodies, and as a result of this, most of our understanding of what it means to be human is based on a male prototype, which is this idea that you're the same version of yourself pretty much, every day of the week. And this just doesn't fit for people with female bodies. And most of the guidance that we've been given about everything ranging from how much sleep we need to how many calories we need to eat a day for what normal sexual functioning looks like. A lot of this guidance that we've been given has been created based on research either conducted on men or conducted on women in the early phases of the menstrual cycle, which is something that scientists do to try to minimize female subjects' differences from male subjects and try to make them maximally similar to one another. And then we're given this guidance, and we're told essentially that we need to be doing the same thing every day, and that our body's needs are the same every day. And that just simply isn't true if you're somebody with a female body in a cycle. And the result of that is that, half of our lives, we're trying to operate according to an owner's manual that was created for men or for women in the estrogenic follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. And the result is that a lot of women don't feel their best during the last 2 weeks of the cycle. And so part of what I do in the period brain is just really trying to help women understand how their changing sex hormones influence the way that they experience themselves and experience the world around them. And then also understand in particular what they've never been told about the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, and the ways that our recovery needs change, and the way that our pain perception changes, and the way that our sexual desire changes, and the way that our energy needs and recovery needs change. And so I kind of try to provide women with this almost like a user's manual for the second half of the menstrual cycle that none of us have been given, just simply because we've all been treated as one size fits all when it just doesn't work.
So, what would it look like then for a modern society to truly accommodate that progesterone phase rather than
Mhm.
pathologize it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of this is just like the way I think about it isn't like, we need to totally overturn the workplace and, and we need to, have everybody measuring their cycles and know what's, going on this way and that way. And then we can give people, recommendations accordingly. Instead, the way that I see this playing out more is one at the individual level for giving women a language to understand what's happening within themselves, and then also being able to communicate with those around them about what their needs are. So, I talk about changing calorie needs and changing sleep needs and changing recovery needs and changing sexual needs, and understanding these things, being able to articulate them to yourself, being able to articulate them to a partner, and then being able to create micro environments within our own lives that are optimized for what our bodies need. But then at the sort of larger, more global level, I do think that we will get into a time, hopefully sometime soon, where we have things like medicine that's tailored based on what's happening hormonally, because there's every reason to believe, based on research on what is currently referred to as like premenstrual exacerbations of different types of chronic conditions, because many women have changes in their symptomology of chronic conditions that they have, whether it's an autoimmune disease or diabetes or ADHD or major depressive disorder, where women or asthma is another one that's frequently found to have premenstrual worsening. The researchers or physicians have been noting this for a really long time, that women will have these like breakthrough symptoms, especially premenstrually. And, there's every reason to believe that this has in part to do with just the way that we experience our bodies changes, but also that even the way that our bodies metabolize drugs differs across the cycle. And that we may have phase specific treatment. We may be able to come up with more specific recommendations about when women should be getting surgeries and vaccines and other things that recruit the immune system, because we know that the immune system is modulated by each estrogen and progesterone. And so, I see the world moving forward in these small ways, not where we have, totally rearranged the way that everybody is doing everything, but instead a world where women understand their bodies, are able to have a language to explain to themselves what they need, and be able to explain to others around them what they need. And then also being able to have precision medicine that's actually made for female bodies.
There's a specific line in your writing that really stuck with me, and I'm sure resonates with women out there. And so you've written that it doesn't make biological sense that women should have inherited a tendency to feel bad half the time. So from an evolutionary perspective, do you think what we now call PMS once had an adaptive value, maybe promoting rest, withdrawal, caution, and if so, how may understanding that original function change how women interpret their mood shifts they experience today?
Yeah, so I think that we can really think about PMS and like contemporary PMS as having three distinct causes. And one of them gets at that sort of ancestral evolutionary piece, and then the other ones are a little bit more environmentally mediated. But let's just like talk through these. So like the first, thing that contributes to what we consider PMS are things that actually are happening in the body on purpose because they are serving a function. Right. And when you look at like the symptoms of PMS, as they've been described in the research literature, there's like 142 of them. Right. And so it's essentially this huge list of experiences that's really just a hodgepodge of the way that women feel, some of which are things that are happening on purpose, and other things that are happening either as a byproduct of the fact that we're not accounting for our cyclicity in the way that we're, being given recommendations for what we're supposed to be doing to ourselves, and others that are due to a lack of resilience to hormonal changes that are the result of a chronic inflammation and chronic stress. And so, just to kind of unpack each of these three categories, the first of these categories are things that are happening on purpose. And just to give an example of this, many women experience decreases in libido in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And this is something that is described as a symptom of PMS. And this is something that's happening on purpose because our body is shifting gears from a state that's optimized for attraction and sex, which a lot of women experience an uptick in sexual desire. They feel sexier, they want more sex, they have more sex, they look sexier, they smell sexier. I mean, there's all of this great research showing that women are really primed for sex and attracting mates in the phase of the cycle, particularly right around ovulation when sex can lead to conception. And evolutionarily, this makes really good sense that the female body would be optimized in this way at this time when sex can lead to conception. Then, when you shift into the second phase of the menstrual cycle, when you shift into the luteal phase, when sex can no longer lead to conception, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for women's bodies to be investing tons of energetic resources in attracting mates and having a lot of sexual activity. And in fact, sexual activity, creates a small inflammatory event in the vaginal canal and near the cervix, which may not be necessarily optimal for implantation and pregnancy. And it's also not optimal just in the fact that it's going to cause, anytime that you have an inflammatory event in the body, it raises your basal metabolic rate further. It recruits energy that can be used for other things like preparing for the possibility of pregnancy. And so there's a lot of reasons that we see women's sexual desire shift gears a little bit in the second half of the cycle and get dampened. And this is something that makes absolute evolutionary sense. It is, it's a wise use of resources to not have the foot, have our foot on the gas pedal of sexual desire and attraction all the time, and instead be able to actually modulate the effort that we're putting into those activities, dependent on whether or not sex can lead to conception. And so that, is like one example of just one of the many ways that our bodies shift in ways that are happening on purpose that we're not given language to understand. And so it feels like pathology. And so there's a lot of the sort of PMS question mark that is the result of that. Another thing that happens that creates symptoms of PMS, and let's talk about, for example, low energy and food craving, because these are two that are common and also show up on the big, list of whatever it is, 140 or 170 different symptoms. These are oftentimes the result of the fact that women are given bad nutritional guidance based on their menstrual cycle. And so, most of us, like if I were to ask you, how much do you need to eat on a given day? All of us have some given guideline that, usually we got from a nutritionist that, you're supposed to eat, let's say 2,000 calories a day if you're an active adult. Right. And so it's one size fits all. And that the only thing that we're expected to vary our nutritional intake on is how much physical activity we have. But the fact is, the female body has a different resting metabolic rate depending on where you are in the menstrual cycle. And in the second half of the menstrual cycle, or the luteal phase, when progesterone is being released, our resting metabolic rate increases from 7 to 11%. And so if you're somebody who is eating that 2,000 calories a day as an active adult, right, this could mean an extra additional 200 calories a day that your body is burning through without you doing anything different. And if you're not told this, right, and instead you're following that, one size fits all set of nutritional guidelines that your nutritionist gave you, you're going to be hungry, you're going to have food cravings, and you're going to be tired. And you're probably going to be cranky. Like, I know when I don't eat enough, I get really cranky. And another sort of more pernicious effect of all of this is that generations of women have been taught to distrust their body. It's like, because their body is telling them, I need to eat more food. And then their nutritionist is saying, no, you only need to eat 2,000 calories a day. That's what you need to be doing. And I think that so many women for so long have felt betrayed by their bodies, have felt like their body is the enemy because they've been given guidance that just doesn't always fit for a female body that cycles. And so, part of the sets of symptoms that we see from PMS are the result of our body reacting to the fact that we're treating it using one size fits all rules that don't fit. So that's the second category of features that contributes to PMS. And then the third one is the fact that, we do live in an environment where people eat a lot of processed foods. We don't have the types of social relationships that we used to have because everybody is so caught up in, their kids' activities and work and other outside work obligations that people aren't able to prioritize their relationships. They're not able to prioritize exercise. They're not able to prioritize the regulation of their stress response. And all of these factors together have the effect of eroding at what I call resilience to hormonal changes. And essentially, it's eroding at our cellular plasticity, which is something that gets chipped away at by chronic inflammation and chronic stress response.
Yeah.
And when we don't have a lot of cellular plasticity, that means that all of the cells in our body that respond to our changing hormone levels and changing neurotransmitter levels and changing rates of neurotransmission that happen as a result of our hormonal changes, that they're not able to quickly adapt. And when they're not able to quickly adapt, instead of feeling like our mood or our energy levels or our sexual desire is sort of coasting, along a little bit of a winding road, it feels like climbing and careening off the side of a cliff.
Mm.
And so some of the symptoms or the experiences that women have in the second half of the cycle, especially, extremes in mood. Some mood changes are very adaptive, as noted. We do experience shifts and things like you had noted, like introspection, and women tend to be more cautious with risk taking. And all of this is guided toward protecting the body and protecting possibly implanting embryo, and also managing the metabolic demands of the second half of the cycle. As your resting metabolic rate is increasing, it's conserving energy. But like if you're experiencing extreme mood changes and where you're feeling incredibly hostile or incredibly sad, a lot of this is the result of not like our body not being able to adapt quickly enough to our changing hormone levels in ways that feel a lot worse than what they need to. And here the answer is just really a matter of taking steps to lower inflammation, improve the communication between your brain and your stress response, and sort of help to rebuild your resilience to hormonal changes.
Hmm. Now, I think it's pretty certain that progesterone is a really misunderstood hormone. And I've heard you talk about how it's meant to make you feel grounded and centered rather than miserable. So what do we get wrong about it? And sort of what would a progesterone friendly lifestyle, if you will, actually look like?
Right. So, one of the reasons that I think that it's really gotten a bad rap is that everybody confuses it with the progestins that are in hormonal birth control. And those make women feel really awful. For the most part, most women don't like the way that they feel in response to a progestin. And progestins can activate the stress response. They can cause big changes in mood. When it's used in hormone therapy instead of bioidentical micronized progesterone, progestins are related to an increased cancer risk. I mean, they have all of these, like, progestins have a lot of negative side effects that people oftentimes will, just use interchangeably progestin and progesterone.
Mm.
And then people think that progesterone does all of these terrible things when the fact is that it actually does none of those things. And it's a mental health superhero in a lot of ways, because progesterone, not only does it has these beautiful anti-inflammatory effects in the entire body. So it taps the brakes on the immune system and allowing our body to sort of marinate in an anti-inflammatory state is very positive for health and very positive for longevity. It also activates GABA receptors in the brain and leads to what we call like inhibitory neurotransmission. And the reason that it does this is that when it gets broken down in the body, it releases a really potent neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone stimulates GABA receptors, which are the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter system in our brain. And this has the effect of calming the brain down, right? And it increases our resilience to stress and allows us to be able to sort of overcome stressful situations in a way that's more seamless than what we see when we have less GABAergic activity in the brain. What's interesting, with progestins, so again, just to really quickly dovetail back into the synthetic progesterone that's in hormonal birth control, because that stuff is not made from progesterone, most of it is synthesized from testosterone. it doesn't, when it's broken down in the body, doesn't lead to the release of allopregnanolone, right? This really wonderful, calming neurosteroid. And this is actually believed to be one of the mechanisms behind the fact that women who are on hormonal birth control are generally at a greater risk of developing major depressive disorder and experiencing anxiety disorders. And the leading hypothesis for the reason behind this has to do with the lack of GABAergic neurotransmission in the brain as a result of low levels of allopregnanolone. And so, progesterone, the stuff that we release when we cycle, and if you're having hormone therapy using biologically identical micronized progesterone, it has these really lovely effects. It's anti-proliferative, meaning that it also has anti-cancer effects, both in the breast and in the cervix and in the uterus. And so it has a lot of really nice effects in the body. And I think, one of the reasons that it got a bad rap is that, yes, people confuse it with progestin, and progestin doesn't generally make people feel better, and it doesn't have the positive health effects of progesterone. But also, there are some women who are sensitive to changing levels of progesterone. And again, sometimes and often, this is the result of lacking resilience to hormonal changes. And because the second half of the menstrual cycle, the rise and fall of progesterone is just at these very high levels. Like, if you look at peak levels of estrogen in the first half of the menstrual cycle, and which, we all know that estrogen is an important hormone, and that we get these really great feelings when estrogen is rising and peaking. Estrogen peaks at levels that are 10 times lower than peak levels of progesterone. And so the changes that happen in the second half of the menstrual cycle are just huge compared to what goes on in the first half. And so it does require a lot more plasticity of our cells to be able to adapt to that. And for women who aren't able to quickly adapt to the changing levels of neurotransmission and then also hormone release that are happening in the second half of the menstrual cycle, especially when they get into the what we call the late luteal phase, which is generally the week before you get your period, and your progesterone levels are falling. For women whose bodies are not able to quickly adapt to that, it's like removing this really calming neurosteroid. And it's like you have all of these naked receptors that are like wondering what's happening and why they're not getting enough GABAergic neurotransmission. And this can make women feel anxious and sad. And so I think that also the experience that women who do lack resilience to hormonal changes experience, especially in the late luteal phase when progesterone is falling, it can make women feel pretty bad. And this, I think, also is what gives it a bad rap, is that people think that the issue is progesterone, but really the issue is the withdrawal from progesterone and the fact that their body isn't adapting quickly enough. And one of the things that I talk about in the period brain is just ways that we can build resilience to hormonal changes, because it really shouldn't feel that way. It's normal for women to feel changes in mood as they shift across the cycle, as the body is shifting gears between doing one set of activities to another set of activities. But it really shouldn't feel so terrible that, women are having their day ruined
Mm.
by what's happening with their hormones.
And if you could, what are some of those ways that women could do that?
Yeah, I mean, and some of them are just, it's just the old fashioned advice that your grandma gave you, but there's a lot of really good science behind it. And one of the big killers of resilience to hormonal changes is inflammatory activity in the body. And a lot of the things that we can do to improve the state of inflammation in our body is one, is not eating a terrible diet with a lot of processed foods that have an inflammatory effect on the gut and then also the rest of the body. And so, shifting to a healthier, more whole food focused diet. And the good news is, like when people talk about diet, like there's really no and there's been so much research, I mean, in nutrition. Like if you go into nutrition research, I mean, you can really go down a rabbit hole. But what all of this research has concluded, when you look at meta-analyses, what they find is that there's no one best diet, but all best diets have the same things in common, and that is limiting processed foods, right? So limiting flour and sugar and all of those other things that hide in the Western diet, eating a lot of plants, so eating things with fiber and lots of phytochemicals in it, right? If you're eating animal products, to eat like things that are sourced in as close to their original state as possible. So eating, for example, grass fed red meat rather than eating corn fed red meat. So, taking some of those steps, limiting or not including dairy. There's a lot of sort of back and forth on dairy, but, and then, having your fat sources be, full of those like long chain fatty acids. So things like olive oil. But in whether that means that you go keto or you're like paleo or you're Mediterranean or you're vegan, what feels best in your body and what your body responds best to. Everybody is a little bit different, and there is no agreement about what the best diet is. And there is now a growing consensus that what the optimal diet is likely differs inter-individually, but it does still have all of these same components, right? So it doesn't need to be endlessly confusing. And there's also a lot of room for flexibility for your own taste. Like I tend to eat mostly like a Mediterranean, like a pretty Mediterranean type diet. And that feels best for me. But I know other people who don't feel best that way and they feel better doing something else. And their blood work is better when they do something else.
Mm.
But they all have these core ingredients in common, which is like staying away from processed food and really focusing on, on plants and then healthy sources of fat and then well sourced animal protein. And so that's like one thing. Exercise is and continues to be the most underutilized antidepressant that exists. And there's so much good research showing that exercise has potent effects on our resilience to hormonal changes, and especially the mood-related changes that women can experience as they transition into the second half of the cycle. And it's so therapeutic, and it doesn't need to be again, overly complicated. Sometimes I think that people, especially they start listening to some of the podcasts that are about fitness and this sort of, that it's very easy to get overwhelmed to a point where you just don't even want to exercise at all because you feel like you're going to be doing it wrong. And you don't need to, it doesn't need to be that complicated. You just really need to put on some sneakers and go outside even for a 30-minute walk. And that's better than doing nothing, and then if you are able to also add in, two or so 30 to 45-minute resistance training activities every week, more power to you. That's even better. And it's going to continue to promote your resilience to hormonal changes and also just, promote the physical health of your body. And I think that one of the things that people forget is that like the brain is a body part.
Mm.
And when the health of our body is good, like we feel it in our mental health and we feel it in the clarity of our thinking and we feel it in the quality of the decisions that we make. And it's just like the brain is a body part. And when you treat your body well and you take steps to keep the health of your body, intact, it really does pay off in all domains of life and not just like what you look like in your jeans or how, quickly you can do a mile. But instead, it really does help with promoting resilience to hormonal changes. It also helps to promote healthy cycles. And, one thing that I think that women aren't, well, it's because we're never taught about this, but it's just that, cycling and this process of, producing and releasing an egg every month is how our bodies produce almost all of their sex hormones.
Mm.
And so we also, anything that we can do to support ovulation is also going to help keep our hormones in balance, help us produce both, the levels of estrogen and progesterone that are optimal for women, and also further support the health of our bodies, including our mental health. And so, taking steps to improve the health of your body can really it can do so much good, both in terms of promoting hormone release, but then also promoting and encouraging an ability to shift through our hormonal changes in ways that feel non-awful.
And even something like exercise, this is the health and fitness is a whole other sphere in which is so different for women and men, right? We just had Dr. Stacey Sims on a few weeks ago talking about how most of the generalized health and fitness advice out there fails women, and how nuanced that is for women to approach, which kind of brings me to another part of your writing that stuck with me, and you said that sort of in trying to be treated equally, women were encouraged to act as if hormones don't matter. But that silence has actually deepened inequality. So, with that in mind, how can feminism start to reclaim biology then?
Right. I mean, I think that just simply acknowledging the fact that our hormones matter
Hmm.
and starting to lean in the direction of testing women based on, like when we're including women in research, looking at cycle phase as a variable. And because it's likely to impact outcomes when it comes to everything ranging from the way that we metabolize drugs to the way that our bodies respond to surgery to the way that our bodies respond to therapeutic interventions. There's been some really interesting research looking at the way that women respond to treatment for PTSD and how the effectiveness of those therapies seems to shift across the cycle, and that there may be an optimal cycle phase for doing extinction based training for people with PTSD. Physical training, like strength training, there's some research evidence that supports the idea that you may get more bang for your buck out of strength training that is happening in the first half of the cycle compared to the second half of the cycle. I think just really embracing the fact that our hormones matter, that they shift what's going on from our body in our bodies from head to toe, and that there's nothing wrong with this. It's like I think that it's like somebody told women at some point that having cycling hormones was a weakness and a sign of a problem, and therefore should call into question a woman's ability to vote. And women just accepted that as truth, when the fact of the matter is there's just nothing about that that's inherently true. And it'd be very easy for us to just turn that, whole argument on its head and say, well, you know, one hormone, like, you're way too simple. Like, how can you possibly make a good decision when you only have one primary sex hormone? And if you aren't cycling and able to look at things from multiple perspectives, your brain is just far too simple to make a good decision. It's like male and female brains are different, but they're both really good at making decisions. And we need to stop leaning into this fear that there's something wrong with the fact that our hormone cycle, and embrace it. Because like I said, I really do think that, the next step forward as we move from what I've, heard Peter Attia talk about as like, medicine 2.0 to medicine
Hmm.
3.0, is moving into also medicine that accounts for the fact that women's hormone cycle, both within a menstrual cycle and then across a lifetime, and then being able to make tailored recommendations to women based on what's happening hormonally. Because the fact is, probably matters, right? And just ignoring it and sweeping it under the rug doesn't do anything for us. And in fact, it can really harm us and prevent us from getting the care we need, prevent us from getting, the types of recommendations that we need about what we need to be doing to care for our bodies, and get us away from this narrative of body as enemy. Like, I mean, I don't know very many women who don't have a somewhat problematic relationship with their physical bodies. And I think that part of this is that we've been told that we need to do this. Our body is telling us we need to do that. And then we think our body is the problem. And the fact is that, we're living in an environment where we're not being given the guidance for what our body actually needs. And so it's really easy to develop a pathological relationship with your body when it's telling you what you think is the wrong thing. And it's so sad that for so long women didn't even think to question the wisdom of the advice that we've been given, and so we just turn the blame inward. And I think that we need to change that. And I think that it really embracing the fact that our hormones matter a whole lot more than we've been originally taught to believe is true is the first step in that journey.
Now, another sort of area of this work that people are really fascinated by is the effect on attraction, desire. A quote I have of yours here is that hormones don't just change how we feel, they change who we want. And so in your research, you've shown that hormonal shifts can subtly influence who we're attracted to. But what do these changes tell us about the biology of desire, and how much control we have over who we are attracted to?
Right. I don't think we have control over who we're attracted to. And I think that, and when I was younger, I don't know that this is as true now, but I'm sure it is because, people would just like, like gang up on people for who they're attracted to, right? Like, oh, you're shallow, or, oh, you're paying too much attention to this, or oh, you shouldn't like someone for this reason. And, and all of that's just is just BS. It's like there's a reason that they say the heart wants what it wants. It's like it does, it wants what it wants. And we are wired, with a very complex and nuanced attraction psychology. And we have inherited this from our successful ancestors who somehow, in an unbroken chain, have been able to successfully attract a romantic partner, have sex with them, and have an offspring. Because, for millions of years, you are currently, the descendant of an unbroken chain of people who've successfully mated. And so you've inherited this really rich psychology from these people, who have reliably been able to attract a mate, maintain a mate, and have offspring, and then have successful offspring. And so we do have a very complex psychology with respect to who we are attracted to. And there are a lot of features of this that are very much kind of like what we consider human universals. Right. So, for example, we know that women, to a greater extent than men, tend to value cues related to ambition and industriousness, and qualities related to good provisioning, to a greater extent than do men value these qualities in women. And the reason for this is that throughout most of evolutionary time, women were very dependent on men for provisioning and for protection. And women didn't have the opportunity to go out and get resources on their own because they were caring for children and giving birth to children, and they couldn't protect themselves because there were no ADT home security systems, right? And instead, they were reliant on somebody who's larger and more formidable to be able to protect themselves, their children, their family. And, so we tend to see that women exhibit a heightened preference for these kinds of qualities because over the course of evolutionary time, women who had that preference would have successfully mated to a greater extent than women who didn't pay attention to those qualities, right? Or didn't desire those qualities. And so we do tend to see some universals when it comes to human mate preferences. But what's really fascinating to me is that there's also a lot of idiosyncrasy to it. And this is one of those things that, science just hasn't quite figured out yet. Like, we think that it has something to do with like having dissimilar immune genes, or maybe it has something to do with, qualities that they possess that you've seen in successful others in your environment. Like, we don't know yet what all of these little, sort of idiosyncrasies are in our partner choice, but they are what they are. And what makes that so fascinating is that it's like, while there is this like core universality of some of our mate preferences, right? Both men and women want somebody who's kind and understanding, who's healthy, who would be a good parent if you choose to have children, right? These are qualities we all desire in our partner, somebody with an interesting personality. And these are sort of core human universals. We also have some things that are universally sex differentiated, again, with women having a greater preference for cues related to provisioning. We tend to see that men tend to have a heightened preference for cues related to physical attractiveness, and particularly cues that have historically been related to youth and fertility, because both of those things, obviously, if you were a man throughout most of evolutionary time, if you had a heightened preference for qualities associated with an older mate, you wouldn't have passed that
Mm.
preference down to anybody because your older mate would be in menopause. And I'm not, that's not a very inheritable trait. You wouldn't be passing that preference on to as many offspring as men who had a preference for qualities related to fertility and to youth, which is related to a construct in evolutionary biology. We call it reproductive value, but it just means how long is your reproductive shelf life? Like, how many years are you going to be able to reproduce, essentially. And so we tend to see some core universal sex differences as well, with, men kind of favoring youthfulness and attractiveness, and women having, tending to favor resource access and ambition. And then we get the nuances. And like I said, nobody really quite understands this. But it's really fascinating because it really does play an important role in guiding preferences, to the same extent that we see prioritizing these sort of core universals in human mate preferences.
Wow. So given everything we've talked about there, and given everything we know about the hormonal influence on attraction. How can someone distinguish between what's biologically driven and what's
Mhm.
genuinely them?
We are our biology, so
Mm,
there's no distinguishing those. I mean, as somebody with a background in evolutionary biology and neuroscience and neuroendocrinology, I am as strict of a materialist as you will ever find. And when I say that, I just mean that I ultimately reduce everything down to the gears and sprockets that go on in our brain.
mhm,
And so there's really no way around that because even, yeah, like I wrote in my first book, "This is your brain on birth control." It's like everything about us is biological, and you've got brain structures that you can use to explain it. Like even the most random thing, like if I were to ask you right now to imagine a chimpanzee doing the hokey pokey with Justin Bieber, right? You can call up an imagery of that, and all of
mhm,
that is a result of biological processes happening in your brain. And so even though it feels very sort of right now and of the moment in you, right, it's a result of a biological process. And so we can understand, when we try to understand and sort of reduce what the elements are that guide partner choice. I mean, absolutely, our hormones play an important role in that. And we can see this played out in some of the research that shows that, when women are put on hormonal birth control, which shuts down their hormone production, and so they're no longer, cycling through estrogen and progesterone, and instead are in a consistent state where progestin, that synthetic progesterone, is the primary sex hormone and estrogen levels are really low. We tend to see that women tend to exhibit a lesser preference for qualities related to just like what I would consider like base sexual attraction. So there's less of a priority placed on just like your actual like physical attraction to someone. And instead, when they're choosing partners, they tend to place a greater emphasis on some of the other more tangible qualities that women also prioritize in partner choice. Things like whether or not the person is going to be able to provision, for example. So,
mhm.
like financial resource holdings, and whether somebody's going to be a good dad. And so what we tend to see, is that we can learn a lot about the role of hormones in guiding partner choice, even just simply by looking at those differences.
Wow. I wonder, are there any specific drastic examples, or what maybe are some of those drastic examples that you've heard or been told of women's attraction being shifted whilst on a certain type of contraceptive pill, maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard, so I mean, what I've seen in the literature is one thing, and then like the stories I've heard from women are another thing. So, in the literature, there is evidence that suggests that for some women, when they choose their partners on hormonal birth control and then they go off it, it can change attraction in the relationship. And that for women who are partnered with sexy mates, that you actually find that women's attraction to their partner increases. And so for these women, they feel more attracted to their partners after they go off of it. For women who are partnered with less sexy mates, what they find is that when these women go off it, they are less attracted to their partner. And then for some women, it just doesn't really make a difference. And what's interesting about that, it's almost like when you were on hormonal birth control, it's like you had blinders on, right? So like one of the facets, right, that influences our partner choice is our qualities related to sexiness. And again, sexiness is one part cues that we all agree on, like testosterone related cues are cues that are sort of universally perceived as sexy in male faces, voices, and behaviors. But there's also idiosyncrasy in sexiness. So that's also one of those things where some people will find, some, like really large hands or forearms, like really sexy, right? And it's like when you have estrogen muted, like you do on hormonal birth control, it's like it puts a blindfold on. Like you're not paying attention to those things as much. And then when you go off of hormonal birth control and you start cycling through estrogen again, it's like all of a sudden these things are very salient and you're paying attention to them. And in some research that we just did, and I actually was just working on this paper, so it's very top of mind. We were looking at changes in sexual desire and attraction in women who chose their partners either on or off of hormonal birth control, and then looked at what happened when they went off of it. And it is really interesting because what we get is very much a split where it's like you get about 25% of women saying that they're more attracted to their partner now that they're off of it. You get about 25% of women saying that they're less attracted to their partner now that they're off it. And then about half of women don't notice any difference at all. So it seems like there's a lot of idiosyncrasy, and a lot of this idiosyncrasy likely has to do with what are the hormones that were in the pill that they were on? What is their hormonal state like when they're off of hormonal birth control, right? What are the number of hormone receptors that they have? How do they metabolize hormones? I mean, I could make a list, 10 miles long that likely contribute to some of the idiosyncrasies in the research. But what this tells us is that for some women, it does change attraction, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And like I said, in the literature, I've seen it played out that way. And in the research studies that we've done in my lab, we've seen it play out that way. But I've also heard, I've heard stories from women that are a lot more contextualized than what I'm able to get, in the science. And I've heard all kinds of stories. I've heard stories from women who didn't realize they didn't like the way their partner smelled until they went off of hormonal birth control. And now they don't like the way that he smells because they're really sensitive to those scent-based cues and they find it unattractive. I've had women who have had the opposite effect where they go off of it and now they're like they didn't even think that they had much of a sexual desire at all. They just thought they kind of outgrew that. And then they went off of hormonal birth control and they just like are cannot get enough of their partner and just find them so attractive. I have heard from women who've gotten divorces after going off of hormonal birth control. I've heard from women who went back on hormonal birth control because they knew that they would get a divorce if they didn't. I've heard from women who thought that they were bisexual and then went off it and then realized that they're actually obligatorily heterosexual or obligatorily lesbian. So I've seen it flip both ways. I've heard from women who went off of hormonal birth control and started growing their hair out, got a boob job, and whitened their teeth. I've heard from women who, when they want to be more focused and feel less feminine, that they go on hormonal birth control on purpose to try to keep their attention focused. And so, I've heard all kinds of stories that are really interesting because, again, they're consistent with what I see in the research literature, but of course, it has so much more texture
Yeah.
and detail and sort of story to it. But each one of those stories that I've heard is very consistent with what you would expect to see when you take someone's hormones and you change them up because hormones have a really, important influence on so many different areas of our brain and the way that we experience ourselves, the way we experience the world, the way we experience our partners, that it would be surprising to me if anything other than that happened.
Wow. Well, this has been a real fascinating hour, and so before I let everyone know where they can connect with yourself and check out the book, sort of final question I want to ask you is based on everything we've talked about today or in your research, if you could snap your fingers and see three changes, whether they be societal changes, legal changes, that instantly materialize from all the research you've done,
Yeah.
changes that would genuinely improve people's lives, what would
Mhm.
those changes be?
Okay, so the first one is that it would be a requirement for researchers to test equal numbers of men and women for any outcome that's being measured. So, in other words, that research would have to assume that sex matters
Mhm.
and that if they're going to only be testing something in one sex or just be combining the sexes together and not testing for differences, that they have to first prove that sex doesn't matter. Because right now, the way that science is done, there's a lot of research that's being done, even in areas like psychiatry, which is an area where we know that there's huge amounts of sex differentiation, where the researchers will conduct research on both men and women but not in large enough numbers to test for sex differentiation. And then they're not testing for sex differences. So instead, they're just lumping men and women together when we know that mental health is different for men and women and that the processes that contribute and detract from mental health are likely to be different as well. So the first one is that it is necessary to test for sex differences and that if you're going to lump men and women together, that you have to first demonstrate that there are not sex differences and you have to demonstrate it convincingly. So that's the first change in the world. And I think honestly, it would revolutionize healthcare because I think that so many of the things that we think that we know about what, heart treatments to use or like how to prevent Alzheimer's disease is absolutely in the dark because it was either conducted on men or male mice in the case of animal research, or males and females or men and women lumped together And I think that what we're going to learn is that, and there's so much research showing that even to the cellular level, there are differences between males and females. And so, like, we need to be testing for sex differences. So that would be one. Number two is that when we test women, we need to test them as women. And that means accounting for the fact that our hormones cycle. And so that would mean that we need to be testing women when they're under the primary control of estrogen in the first half of the cycle, and then under the primary control of progesterone in the second half of the cycle, right? So actually being able to see whether or not the way that the female body responds to things differs depending on hormonal state. And then from that, we can then also make extrapolations onto the way that things are going to be affecting pregnant women and menopausal women. And so just accounting for the fact that women's hormones shift across the cycle and across a lifetime, and then creating and shaping medicine and science in ways that actually respects that and then accounts for it in a way that's going to allow for precision medicine on women. And then lastly, and this one is a little bit of a shifting gears because those are the two things that I like to see in the world. The third is that I think that, and this shifts back to our hormonal birth control conversation.
Mhm.
I wish that all doctors who are prescribing this to especially teenagers we're having to understand what the risk that sort of puts the teenage brain at.
Yeah.
So currently, teenagers are prescribed hormonal birth control for things like acne and regulating their periods. But it doesn't do that. It shuts down their sex hormone production, right? It never teaches their brain and ovaries to communicate with one another. Instead, they're taking this daily pill every day. And there's a growing body of research that shows that it leads to developmental changes in the brain and that it can increase women's risk of developing major depressive disorder when they're adults. And this information is not being shared with girls and their moms. And most of the time, it's not because the doctors are hoarding the information. It's just that they don't know about it because medicine and neuroscience and psychiatry are oftentimes siloed. And the result of this is a lot of the doctors don't know this. And so it's not being communicated. And so, especially when dealing with a teenage population, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that all doctors who are prescribing the pill would know about this information, right? And then be able and then required to communicate it to their especially their teenage patients.
That is fantastic. I can't argue with any of those. I'm sure no one can. But so thank you so much for this today. It's been an absolutely amazing hour. Before you head off, could you please let our audience know who may not be familiar with your work, they want to hear more from you today, they want to check out the Period Brain.
Yes.
Where's the best place to send everyone listening and watching right now?
Good. Well, you can find me on my website, and that is sarahehill.com, and that is Sarah with an H. And the new book, The Period Brain,
There it is.
is being sold everywhere the books are sold. My first book is This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, or How the Pill Changes Everything. And that's also available anywhere that books are sold. So you can find those at your local bookshop. You can find them on Amazon, wherever it is that you prefer to buy books. And then lastly, you can find me on social media. I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is Sarah E. Hill, Ph.D.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure all the links are in the description below. So for everyone
Great.
listening, watching, click on the website, the social media, the book. But yeah, Dr. Sarah Hill, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a privilege.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.